I was trained as a therapist. So I was trained in the pathology paradigm where I had to determine one person to be, I'll put it in quotes, disordered, and I had to give them a diagnosis, and a certain diagnosis would allow them to have a certain amount of sessions and perhaps get coverage by insurance. Even if, let's say, it was traumatic stress, which I don't even love to put the D at the end of that. Why is it disorder that we have a valid human experience from actual trauma? That makes sense. But why does it have to be a disorder?
Yes, it's actually quite ordered.
It is ordered and it's valid and it makes sense.
You're listening to episode 49 of the Happy Space podcast, and today we're looking at how we speak about neurodiversity and the evolution of language with neuroinclusion expert Pasha Marlowe. Hi, I'm Clare Kumar, your proudly neuroatypical host, exploring the intersection of productivity and inclusivity. I believe that everyone ought to be able to make their richest contribution, but too often people are excluded from spaces, cultures, and experiences. We can do better. I hope that you find inspiration and encouragement in these conversations, for everyone deserves a happy space. If you've been following the podcast, you'll already know that I think it's important to get language right, to respect those with whom we are in conversation or speaking about. But sometimes it can be tricky. There's a lot to get right, and language keeps evolving. I'm exploring that today with my guest and neuroinclusion expert, Pasha Marlowe. Today, Pasha is a speaker and consultant helping organizations address neuroinclusion and to cultivate, in her words, neurobelonging. Pasha has been a family and marriage therapist for over 30 years and has 54 years of lived experience as a queer, autistic ADHDer, raising 3 neurodivergent children and coming, as you might expect, from neurodivergent parents. Pasha is also the host of the Neuroqueering podcast. More on that later. Pasha is the author of My Next Husband Will Be a Lesbian, and really an articulate speaker on this topic. We explore language around neurodiversity and the use of the term disorder and impaired. We talk about why it's important to invite people to refer to themselves as they wish. Pasha shares more about the term neuroqueering, and I ask Pasha for her perspective on patience. Do we have what we need to be truly inclusive? Find out in this conversation with Pasha Marlowe. Pasha Marlowe, welcome to the Happy Space podcast.
Thank you for having me, Claire.
I am so excited to speak with you. We got connected through one of my former guests, Lisa Whited, and I had the pleasure of talking with her this morning, so your ears might have been burning. You spoke together at an inclusion conference in Maine, I believe. Yeah.
Yes. We spoke about disability inclusion together. It was great.
Yeah, and she was raving about you, and we got connected, and I immediately have to say I fell in love with the way you are so clear in your message. And I wanted to bring your voice to those who are interested in this conversation, the intersection of productivity and inclusivity, especially about language and identity and how that fosters belonging. It's been interesting as I've stepped into my own diagnosis of autism, have been dealing with the language of neurodiversity and neurodivergency for a few years now. And maybe I'll start with the fact that I feel like I've had to kind of elbow my way into the conversation on neurodiversity and neurodivergency because as a highly sensitive person, a trait that I identified with for almost 10 years, it doesn't show up in a lot of the conversations around neurodivergency. So I was like, well, wait a second. If I understand the meaning of the word, it's logical that to me, that it fits there. But I want to start with this concept of neurodiversity, neurodivergency, and your take on language and what these terms mean and why it's important to honor what they mean.
Yes, thank you. Neurodiversity is diversity of all nervous systems, not just minds and brains, because neuro doesn't mean brain, neuro means nervous system.
Mhm.
And some of us think differently, but some of us also move differently, act differently, love differently, learn differently. So I think it's quite expansive.
Mm.
So that's neurodiversity. We're all neurodiverse. So there's no neurodiverse individuals. We are all, as a human species, neurodiverse, because you need at least two to be diverse. Then there's neurodivergent, and that is an identity, not a diagnosis, but an identity used by anyone who diverges from neuronormativity, not normal, because there is no normal, and normal is a social construct, but diverges from neuronormativity or society's idea of what is the normal, right, or ideal way to, again, not just think, but learn and act and move, and I include love. And so we have this neurodivergent umbrella, which for a lot of people means ADHD, autism, dyslexia, but it's hundreds, including, I would say, those who identify with HSP, those who have innate neurodivergence or acquired neurodivergence, let's say a traumatic brain injury or
Mhm.
epilepsy. And then there's folks who fall under the neurodivergent umbrella for some, like Down syndrome. But if you talk to somebody with Down syndrome, they might want to say, no, I identify as chromosomal diversity, not neurodiversity. So, all that to say, it's really up to the individual person to decide how they identify. And I don't ever argue with somebody's own identity. If you identify as HSP, that's how you identify. I
Mhm.
love to, queer these conversations and remain curious and say, oh, it's interesting. Some people believe that HSP is an ableist term for autism. There's a lot of overlap. Like, let's talk about it, but with respect and compassion, always valuing agency and autonomy for the person to determine on their own, for all the reasons, how they wish to identify. And the only caveat to all this, I will say, is I do believe that experts and teachers and therapists in the field of neurodiversity, I I do believe we need to get some things right. Like, not saying neurodiverse individuals, but in terms of how people identify, such as neurospicy, that's completely up to the individual. And I know you and I have talked about
Mhm.
that, and
Mhm.
your definition or description made so much sense because through your unique lived experience and through your frame of reference, neurospicy felt right. And it wasn't an avoidance of using neurodivergence. It was
Yeah.
for a lot of other personal reasons, which I thought was just such a beautiful example of we have to remain curious and ask people and really explore it from that lens of curiosity and agency.
Yeah. So just to bring listeners up to speed on our conversation, we were talking about the term neurospicy. I write for Glassdoor quite frequently, which is an online platform that is largely anonymous, but not always. And I write there quite openly as who I am. And I was referring to neurodivergency and I put neuroatypical, neurospicy, and I had a lot of pushback from some of the writers there saying, if you want me to take you seriously, you'll use the word neurodivergent, not neurospicy. It's
Mm-hmm.
somebody called it doggo pupper language. And I don't even know what that means, but
Never
I'm
heard that.
assuming it's not to be taken seriously. And so it was interesting because when I use the multiple terms for it,
Yeah.
it's because I recognize that some people don't want to be seen as divergent, i.e. diverging from normal. So I want to come back to normativity and
Okay.
how you chose that word rather than normal. So I
Yes.
want to park that question.
Okay.
But to come back to spicy, just for listeners who are curious why I've had an affinity for spicy, my heritage is part Indian,
Mm-hmm.
and the food, the language, the color, the heat, everything there. I've described India as spicy in many ways, and I nearly named my daughter Masala, which is
Mm.
spice essentially in Hindi. And so I thought, oh, Neuro spicy, I kind of like it because there's a sense of, for me, exotic beauty to spice and resonance and variety and color and flavor. And I thought that word felt really fun for me to lighten it and move it away from disorder, which is
Mm.
one thing I do want to do is I want to invite people to think of the different ways of being as just different ways of being. And there's not one that's
Yes.
better than another. They are different and they all have challenges and strengths.
Mhm.
And I just wanted an openness around thinking about it.
Yeah, and I do want to say that the person who coined the phrase neurodivergent,
Mm,
Kassiane Asasumasu, I really hope I'm pronouncing their last name correctly, back in 1999, a
mhm,
biracial, multi-neurodivergent person,
mhm,
created the word to diverge from the disordered narrative, to
mhm.
offer people an empowered word where they could stand strong in their difference and not feel disordered or othered or all the other terms we use. And so it does offer that, neurodivergent does offer that, and some people also or instead of want to use other terms. It's almost like with the non-apparent and invisible disability
Mhm.
language. I use non-apparent uh, because most of the people I interact with in the disabled community are choosing to use non-apparent. Their reasons are hidden implies that we're hiding something, that we're hiding a disability, and invisible is we're already invisible in some ways as disabled people, and so we don't want to perpetuate that experience and stereotype. However, I was just talking to a brilliant researcher yesterday who's studying for herself invisible disability, and I asked, I
Mhm.
wonder, I'm just curious why you use that term, and her answer was her brain is right now focusing on the action of including people with disabilities. And for her, that's her action and intention and impact. And that's the wording that makes sense to her. And so it was just this really great interaction of, she's aware of all the terms out there, but that's the one that
Mhm.
resonated with her. And she's doing such good advocacy work,
Mhm.
to help disabled people that it's just like, it's who am I to argue with that? Like just this for the same reason we say, who determined disorder in the first place? Who determined what is mentally ill? Who determined what is atypical or abnormal? Like
Mhm.
if we're fighting against that, I don't believe we can also fight against people for their choice of identifying how they wish now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I love that you brought that example up because one of
Mhm.
my questions that I wanted to bring you today was we have other examples, and I want to talk through other examples of language choice, which is evolving
Yes.
in a way to show more respect to the community using
Yes.
it and their preferences, which
Yes.
that's my cat trying to come in because I closed the door. And so there was a thud on the other side of the door. Okay, I'm just gonna
I have
close
never
the
had a
door.
conversation or
There we
podcast
go.
episode with a neurodivergent person where an animal didn't either come in the room or come into the conversation. So this is
Well, there
just
you
the way
go.
we roll. And I'm glad you
Yes,
brought
yes.
that up because there are terms that feel and seem very offensive.
Hey, Happy Space listeners! If you're looking to boost your team's performance, look no further. As a productivity expert and inclusivity advocate, I love showing leaders how inclusivity is the key ingredient in team performance. We travel beyond lip service and explore helping everyone truly bring their best selves to work. Ready to see your team soar? Visit clarekumar.com and book a discovery call today.
For some, neurodiverse individual feels offensive because, for example, in the Black community, they don't want somebody to say you're a diverse hire, you're a diverse person. Like that's just
Mhm.
not accurate, and it's offensive, and it shows a lot. It shows ignorance. And then, for example, the R word that I don't even like to say that some people use for somebody with intellectual disabilities, that is offensive. We've evolved from that. We've evolved and created more gender affirming language, for example. There's so many ways that we have evolved, and I think there are words that I personally feel like we should adopt and words that we should let go of.
Mhm.
And some hold more emotion than others. For example, in the disability community, in general, I'll just speak in generally and for myself, I don't prefer handicap or impaired rather than say a handicap bathroom or a handicap parking spot, say an accessible bathroom, an accessible parking spot, because who are we to say if that person is handicapped or impaired or sees themselves as having an impairment or a challenge? It's just like with mental illness or mental health struggles or mental health challenges. That's up to the individual to determine if they feel like it is an illness or a challenge or a struggle, right? So
Mhm.
anybody who has PTSD or bipolar or schizophrenia, we can't assume that this is disordered or a problem or a challenge. We can't determine that. The person whose life
Mhm.
experience that is can determine that.
Mhm. Mhm. And do you have particular language to talk about mental health then that doesn't label it?
Yeah, I like
Mhm.
saying mental health rather than mental illness, for example,
Yeah. Yeah.
or a mental health experience, or if we're already in the language and in the conversation talking about challenges, I might say mental health challenges. But I feel like experience kind of opens up the door to allow the other person to share their experience. Some
Mhm.
people have diagnoses and some don't. Some people are formally diagnosed, self-diagnosed, and there's a lot of privilege that intersects diagnoses and disclosure. So I don't lean
Yeah.
into formal diagnoses much, but I was trained as a therapist. So I was trained in the pathology paradigm where no matter who presented or how many people, for example, a couple or a family presented, I had to determine one person to be, I'll put in quotes, disordered, and I had to give them a diagnosis, and a certain diagnosis would allow them to have a certain amount of sessions and perhaps get coverage by insurance. Even if, let's say, it was grief recovery or traumatic, like a traumatic stress, which I don't even love to put the D at the end of that. Why is it disorder that we have a valid human experience from actual trauma? That makes sense. But I don't, why does it
Yes.
have to be a
It's actually
disorder?
quite ordered.
It is ordered and it's valid and it makes
Yeah.
sense. But we
Yeah.
stick the D in the DSM,
Mhm.
and as therapists and doctors, we stick the D at the end because that's frankly the way it is right now. But it also sometimes affords people the ability to get services or medication. But I'm hoping in the
Yeah.
future that we ease away from the disordered language of it all and just have it experiences like the traumatic stress.
Mhm.
That's true, you know? Um, yeah, instead of grief
Yeah.
disorder, just grief recovery, for example. So,
Yes.
anyhow.
Yeah, because it's really hooking into that medical model, which perpetuates leaders then saying, we have a process for that. You go to your doctor, you submit your diagnosis, and then you get help. If you don't have that for whatever reason, too bad for you.
Yeah. And there's a lot of privilege in that, right? Being able to
Exactly.
access care, being
Yeah.
able to afford care,
Yeah.
being a parent enough, for example, in our disabilities, for
Yeah.
people to believe that we need support or care.
Yeah. So I'm dealing with a share a personal situation I'm dealing with right now. I have cracked a tooth, and unfortunately, that tooth requires removal and replacement. I will try to use very gentle language for those who don't want to think deeply about this because I sure don't want to think deeply about this. And in learning about what's required, it seems like it's going to be challenging for me on a sensory level, the treatment.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so in discussion with my dentist specialist, we've both agreed that for both of us, it's probably better for me to have general anesthetic.
Mm-hmm.
In the
Mm-hmm.
health coverage, I am trying,
Mm-hmm.
it's been 2 months now. I've been trying to get an answer from the insurance company about coverage of the general anesthetic. Just so you know, it's $2,000 just to have the
Mm-hmm.
general anesthetic.
Mm-hmm.
In Canada, where we pride ourselves on our healthcare, for
Mm-hmm.
which dental is really not included.
Yeah.
So the whole bill is going to be about 10 grand, of which $2,000 is what I call humane treatment. And so I have a line of inquiry now with the insurance company to to figure out whether they're going to cover the kind of pain relief that I need to avoid trauma, body
Yes.
trauma going forward, right?
Yes.
Really interesting conversation. And I really want to pull out, if I have to, the autism diagnosis to support the degree of sensory
Yes.
stimulation that I will feel and the trauma and all of it. I don't know if it's going to go anywhere. They have a
Yeah.
6-week backlog right now, and they're operating by
Mm,
snail mail. And so
mm,
I am super puzzled at how they actually move anything forward. And I basically said the system feels broken, and I feel like the only one who cares about the outcome. I would say
yeah.
my healthcare professional in this is amazing and very compassionate and was recommended to me because my dentist knows that I'm very sensitive.
Yes.
And so he said, you can't, no, don't see the surgeon in our, it won't be a good fit. And he's recommended me to this individual, but still trying to advocate through a system
Right.
for
Right.
humane treatment around sensory issues is really
It's
interesting.
such a good point, too. I've been a
Mm,
therapist for 30 years and specifically in the last five, solely working for people who identify as neurodivergent
yeah.
individuals and couples. And I've yet to meet a neurodivergent person who doesn't have significant medical trauma, a significant amount of sensory overload
Mm,
and
yeah.
fears with medical issues. Um, the there's also there's also a lot of overlap, and I talk about this in my neuroqueering work, but there's a lot of overlap, neurodivergence in the LGBTQIA plus community. And the reason why I bring it up is because something
Mhm.
like medical trauma or sensory issues, like imagine you're a trans person who's having a gender affirming surgery that
Yes.
requires, let's say, binders. That's going to be a sensory issue. It's going to be a trauma issue. It's going to be an affirming issue. It's going to be a disability issue. And to find practitioners
Mm,
who can honor all those intersecting identities and needs is a challenge. And so I feel like it's something that we, as a community of neurodivergent people, if we can even imagine that to be a community, because I think it's most of the world, it's like an enormous community of neurodivergent people.
yeah.
I have reasons for thinking that. You know, we just need to keep it in the conversation because then perhaps insurance companies and doctors and practitioners will start
Mhm.
to honor it and validate it more,
Yeah.
I hope.
Yeah, absolutely. When I went to see the dentist, I started talking about high sensitivity because that's the language I
Yeah.
had available to me. It's like, have you
Hmm.
had highly sensitive patients? Do you know how to accommodate them and make them feel more comfortable? Is this something even on your radar? Right.
Right.
And it's interesting entering into the diagnosis of autism. I feel like now I have a language where people will go, oh, I have some preconceived understanding of what that is now, which I
Yeah.
don't know if it's going to be accurate or not now that I have a much fuller understanding as well. So it's interesting. The labels, this is what we're talking about, labels and identity. And are they helpful? Are they
Hmm.
hurting us?
There is no normal. There is no one right way to be or think or act or move or feel or love. And so normal is a social construct.
Mhm.
And we're not diverging from normal because normal doesn't exist. But we are diverging from society's idea of what is normal. We're diverging from neurotypical standards. And from there, we could branch off into probably capitalistic, patriarchal concepts,
Mhm.
as well as
Mhm.
colonialism and white supremacy and other things. But there's many reasons why the world is the way it is that do
Mhm.
not serve us well, and they're not, the rules aren't made for people who diverge from all of that. So it's diverging from these societal norms,
Mhm.
not diverging from an actual normal.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. And it also, having lived in Japan for 3 years, having spent time in
Mm-hmm.
India and England and Montreal,
Mm-hmm.
I fully believe that you're totally right. The social construct evolves. And so I'm thinking, for example, of how a society deals with crowds and having a lot of people to navigate. And in Japan, one of the evolutionary ways of being is to avoid eye contact and thereby preserve personal space. So
Mm-hmm.
you navigate through and you're just not seeing people, directly.
Mm-hmm.
When I was in Hong Kong and Shanghai, it was more like, oh, you see people and you elbow to get your space. In a Shanghai restaurant, you put your hand on the chair of the person sitting at the restaurant to indicate you want that chair afterwards. So in different cultures, different ways of
Yes.
behaving evolve, even in what would be both more pluralistic societies there, the evolution is different. So what would be normal in one society would be, excuse me, why is your hand on my chair? Like, "Well, I don't understand this pressure," right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
wildly different. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's perhaps commonly understood in the term
Mm-hmm.
neurodivergence.
Mm-hmm.
When I look up, I'm not sure how you say Kassiane, perfect. So if that person's body of work, I've looked for more writing from this
Yeah.
individual to elaborate on this, and I haven't been able to find much to bring more fuller intention around the word neurodivergent. I find that person's name, but that's it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that could be helpful is some work on talking about divergency from what, just as you have right now.
Yes, and if I could offer just a couple of resources, which of course I'm sure we'll share
Yeah.
in the transcript and beyond,
Yes.
because there isn't a lot by Kassane on the internet,
Mhm.
although there are a few really amazing quotes. But you're right, there isn't
Yeah.
a lot, probably because it was 1999 when the work was first established,
Mhm.
and there's
Yeah.
just maybe less available on the internet, and maybe they don't like to be on the internet.
Well,
But that being
that's what that was my
because they're
next
neurodivergent.
question is like, oh, I can't find anything. Well, that's probably intentional.
Yeah, yeah, and smart, really, depending on the day.
Yeah.
So I really enjoy Dr. Nick Walker's work.
Yeah.
Nick Walker wrote Neuroqueer
Hmm.
Heresies,
Hmm.
and she does a brilliant job of identifying and defining all of these nuances. It's very affirming and it's
Yes.
clear. I
Yes.
also really like Sunny Jane Wise's work. They just wrote a book called We Are All Neurodiverse, and that too breaks down a lot
Mm.
of these definitions. And Sunny goes really in a beautiful way deep into the intersectionality, the justice movements,
Hmm.
like the real impact of this work. So
Hmm.
those two are my favorites at the moment.
Yeah. Thank you
Hmm.
for that. We will definitely put the links in the show
Hmm.
notes
Thank
for
you.
listeners. Um, yeah, because I think it's important to have that fuller understanding. Otherwise, we have these reactions. Tell me about the term neurodistinct and what you feel about that.
Sorry, I didn't mean to laugh out loud. So, okay. So neurodistinct is like we're all different, which is the same to me as saying neurodiversity. It's like it doesn't add anything for me. This is my opinion,
Yeah, yeah.
that it doesn't add any.
That's what I was
Yes.
after. Yeah.
Neurodistinct for me does not add anything to the conversation that neurodiversity, neurodiverse, neurodivergent don't already bring.
Mhm.
I will say that, and this is coming recently from Black autistic or Black and or Black disabled creators that I've been following and reading about, that
Mhm.
because neuronormativity is tied into neurotypicality, which is tied into white supremacy, they don't like to use the term neurodivergent. I'm not saying
Mhm.
they as like a whole. I'm just saying these particular creators that I've listened to.
Right.
They prefer neuroexpansive. And so
Mm.
different terms are going to resonate for different people. And to your
Yeah.
point about culture,
Yeah.
depending on the language of their culture, their life experience, their intersectionality, their personal preferences.
Mhm.
And so I think neurodivergent works well, certainly for me and for a lot of
Mhm.
people. But I can also understand why, as we explore and expand our awareness, frankly,
Mhm.
of different
Mhm.
lived experiences and cultures, that other words will arise. I coined a term called neurobelonging, and people are like, "Well, we already have the word belonging. Why bother put neuro in front of it?" And I was like, I feel like as a neurodivergent person, there's this unique experience, especially right now, the world not not accepting us in our authentic self. They say, bring your authentic self to work. Everybody belongs here, but not that mental health part, not
Until I
that
need to slow
autistic
down.
part. Right,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
don't actually bring all of yourself. So then
Mhm.
there's this sense of, okay, well, I do still want to feel belonging inside myself. Like Brene Brown says, you don't want to, fitting in is to see what everybody else wants you to do or see. or act or that fitting in is about other people accepting you,
Yeah.
and belonging is about you bringing your authentic self. So I think, okay, if we're going to belong anywhere, we can't betray ourselves. We have to stay true to ourselves. We have to
Yeah.
stay close to our values and our integrity. And as a neurodivergent person, we are also going to be aware that there are lots of people who will reject our identity, not understand it, misinterpret it, and we still can feel a sense of belonging or neurobelonging inside ourselves wherever we go if we're clear with ourselves as to our identity with
Yeah.
agency and autonomy, how we identify, and 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 our own values, you know?
Yeah.
And so anyhow, I've been playing around with that as a term specifically for the neurodivergent community.
It struck me as, of course it should exist. That term was in it.
Right.
I'm like, yeah, how come I haven't seen this everywhere? It made sense to me. Just as a note, in my thinking too, I've expanded the concept of psychological safety that we talk about. We have physiological safety. We need the air clear and the surfaces wiped and so on. We
Yes.
got that down. We got psychological safety. We have an understanding to feel safe enough to speak up. But I've come up with the term neurological safety. We
Mm-hmm.
need to have
Mm-hmm.
our nervous systems be able to relax in the world and be
Yeah.
not stressed, right? And
Yeah.
so I think there is an evolution to your point of language, and
Yeah.
neurobelonging comes from neurological safety to some extent, that all of those safeties are in place. And then I can fully exhale and actually show up.
Yes. And it's interesting because a lot of people are, we already talk about this in DEI or DEIA or DEIB, these terms, these
Yeah.
experiences. But I was just presenting to a
Yeah.
global HR summit just before I came on here, and there are 4,000 people in my session. And the most common comment
Yeah.
I got was, thank you for specifying the neurodivergent and disabled experience, even
Yeah.
though, of course, we're always talking about diversity and equity and inclusion and belonging.
Mhm.
It really spoke to me, and I finally felt seen and heard in my unique experience as a neurodivergent person,
Yeah.
and also with sensory issues, and as you're talking about,
Mhm.
that sometimes doesn't feel like the conversation is deep enough and personal enough to really feel that sense that we're understood and seen. And I assume there's lots of people from different cultures that would feel exactly the same way. Like,
Mhm.
just saying we support DEIB or DEIA and JEDI and all of it doesn't actually mean the person feels supported and seen. Just like if I said right now, this is a safe space for you to
Mhm.
share,
Mhm.
that's my intention, that I'm a safe person and this is a safe space. But I can't guarantee that.
Yeah.
You might not feel safe. There might be trauma I don't understand, or you might have just experienced grief that I don't know about, or there might be something about the way I speak or act that might make you feel unsafe. So I can't guarantee safety.
Yeah.
So I think about how we
Yeah.
shouldn't make assumptions as much as we often do. I shouldn't make assumptions
Well,
as much as I do.
assumptions are part of how we operate. It's our
Right.
shortcut to, to moving forward with some kind of pace. But what questions can we ask, and how do we invite that reflection? And when I was just talking with Lisa, who I mentioned at the top of our discussion, I said, what if we started meetings by saying, my intent here is to create a dialogue and conversation that displays my respect for you. If I
Mm-hmm.
say anything that feels otherwise, could you please let me know so I can better
Mm-hmm.
understand how I can demonstrate my respect? And so
Yes.
I think if we have that kind of going in position to not assume that we've figured out what safety is, right?
Right.
And that it's evolving and that people might show up with different perspectives, but to be open to saying, oh my gosh, that made me uncomfortable. And here's why. And to
Yes.
invite that dialogue, I think that's true safety, is the
Yes.
ability to have the conversations
Mm-hmm.
rather
Mm-hmm.
than assuming that we've ticked the box because we've said, I just did my DEI training. Thanks. I'm good. It's
Right.
like, yeah,
Yes.
maybe, maybe not,
And in the world of psychological safety, it's really only when the most vulnerable, the most underrepresented, those with the most
Mhm.
marginalized identities feel
Yeah.
seen or have the opportunity to speak out, that there can be
Yeah.
psychological safety. And I think about it in the sense of inclusive design versus universal design, really meeting the specific needs of people, kind of solving for one and serving many, and
Mhm.
making these like you're saying, if you start every meeting that way,
Yeah.
then you don't need to go around the room, for example, checking in to see how everybody's doing, nor do you need to have anybody disclose anything they're not comfortable with or put in the
Yes.
chat something they're not comfortable with. You're offering this space, assuming that there are people with emotional support needs or potentially
Mhm.
physical support needs and beyond. And I think that's a direction we should all go, where we're assuming there are access and support needs, and that's
Exactly.
inclusive design. So we don't have to wait for there to be a problem before we offer a solution.
That's exactly right. It's the physical design, it's the cultural design, it's that
Hmm.
space of invitation
Yes.
and safety to speak up. I think that combine to create that space that we're going to find more people are speaking up for their needs then, or speaking up for somebody else who you know where their needs are. Oh, so and so's coming. We need to make sure this is set. Or
Yes.
how lovely would that be? That forethought.
Yes, that's so beautiful because a lot of people choose not to be on camera. Let's say there's a remote call. A lot of people choose not to be on camera. And if you don't take the time to look at who the participants are, you might not say hello to them, or you might not think to offer, for example, a visual description of who's speaking, or offer your
Yeah,
pronouns. If you
yeah,
make assumptions as to who's in the room, oh, they know me, oh, they don't have any needs, then you're really missing an opportunity
yeah,
to meet everybody's needs, but really
yeah,
specifically those
yeah,
that aren't able, or for whatever reason aren't speaking up or able to speak up.
yeah. In my perception, it needs this mindset shift to opening to
Hmm.
have this kind of thinking. And then practically, it needs patience to be able to stand in that and create that opportunity for people to find their voice, for people to recognize, oh, yes, we're going to get the captions on, or we're going to add those descriptions. There's a slowing down required here that
Yes.
I think is a challenge for a lot of organizations and people, type A people in particular. I would throw myself into that bucket. I remember going to a meeting years ago for some sales training, and it was observing the way the trainer was actually leading it until I understood why I was impatient. And I was like, why are we not getting to the
Mm-hmm.
point? Then I understood why he was doing what he was doing. And I was like, oh, there was a lot of beauty in that. I wonder, what's your sense in this work of the appetite for the patience required to cultivate this space?
There is much patience needed. I need to put a pin in patience just for a second, because one of the things you just said reminded me of a question that I get often at the end of my presentations,
Mm,
where, for example, the president of a university will say, "This is great. I love this idea of neuroinclusion.
yeah.
I love the idea of people having the agency, autonomy to identify how they wish and speak as they wish and act as they wish." He's like, "But what about the fact that there's also rules and restrictions and parameters that we want students to follow?"
Mhm.
And and I mentioned one of the things you just did, which is it's good to understand the why. Like, let's close the loop. And this is
Yeah.
especially important, I think, for autistic people, but a lot of people who just need to, like, I don't want to just follow a rule because it's a rule, right? And we could talk about PDA too, but I want to understand why. Why do you want me to go to chapel service on
Isn't
Sunday?
it Tracy
Why?
Chapman's? Give me a reason to
Right.
take you. Right? It's give me a reason. Like, give me a
Right.
reason.
Yes. And so when I coming back to patients, I didn't forget, when I in my presentations, I always have closed captions running live,
Yeah.
and if possible, I have a interpreter,
Yeah.
right? Which, by
Yeah.
the way, is not just for people in the audience who identify as deaf, but also for people in the audience who have acquired some hearing difficulties. And then there's also people in the audience who surprise themselves as, I was so much more engaged because I was watching the interpreter and
Um,
interpreting the words differently. I would totally be in that bucket. I'd be like, I want to see the words on the screen and the interpreter and hear your voice and look at the slide. I want to have as
yeah.
much sensory experience as possible to stay engaged in this
Yeah.
meeting, right? And
Yeah.
so it's just been so cool to attack the problem of patience with a creativity and a curiosity around how can we do this differently? Like, not only what are the benefits of it,
Maybe it's
because
more
that's
effective.
boring.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, we could easily talk about the business case
Mm.
for having a more diverse workforce,
Yeah. Yeah.
innovation, creativity, problem solving, less groupthink, all the things,
Mhm.
which I think people on some level know. But then there's more nuance to it. There's more engagement in the conversation about preferences and
Yes.
intersectionality and agency that I think make
Yes.
it a little bit more interesting and less boring, and thus hopefully people would become
More
less
effective.
impatient.
Yeah. When I interviewed Judy Singer, and there's a lot of controversy around Judy and her positions and way of articulating things now, one of the things she said to me around language was that if you want to use a term, check with the people that are using the term to see if you belong there. And it puzzled me a little bit. So, as a highly sensitive person, wanting to be considered neurodivergent because the conversation is on the table about neurodivergency, and I don't want to be left out of the conversation, personal motivation. I I asked her about high sensitivity. Do you think it's included in neurodivergency or not? Her response was that she wasn't a psychologist, so she couldn't comment. When I talk to other people in different spheres too, they don't want to comment, don't want to comment. And so I'm like, how can I wrestle with this when it makes sense to me that neurodivergency totally applies to high sensitivity the way I see it in the context of North American culture right now. So how can it not be? But this
Yeah.
concept of a language of a group needing to say, I'll let you in.
No.
I was like, huh, really?
No, I don't like that
Yeah,
gatekeeping dynamic. I think that
yeah.
exists quite a bit in the neurodivergent dialogue. Uh,
Mhm.
and I think because it's so darn personal for people, that
Yeah,
people want to be respected and understood, and I
yeah.
identify the way they want, and again, I'm kind of expanding this into also the LGBTQIA and queer community, which will transition into your neuroqueering question.
Thank you. I love how
And
you're holding all the things.
trying to,
You
but I
go.
don't think you could be, sorry, Judy Singer, neurodiversity affirming and not be gender affirming and not be LGBTQIA affirming.
Mhm.
And so and come to the elephant in the room about some of the transphobic comments that Judy has made. If somebody says they are trans, believe them. Like, if somebody says they're ADHD, I think we should believe them,
Mhm.
right? I don't think that we should get into a like academic exercise to ultimately reject and challenge that person's identity. I just think that there's way too much harm in that. I don't think it does any good.
It's a real, I don't think I want to get into that big conversation again
It's
right
okay.
now
It's okay.
because it's very sensitive. I think what I will take away from that discussion was there was a clinging to language and identity from a perspective
Hmm.
of it making sense and trying to make sense of the world and it be right, more than there was any appetite for someone to be who they want to be. So it was really about the nomenclature. That was the struggle. And my
Yeah.
point in the discussion was, but if there are only a few options in society, if the words don't exist and there's only
Right.
two bathrooms, for example,
Mm.
someone's forced to make a choice. They're
Mm.
forced to make a choice. And that, in some situations, makes one person uncomfortable and it might make another person uncomfortable. And until we have inclusive design supporting the options that people are looking for to show up and be comfortable, we're going
Hmm.
to have tension. We're going to have
Yes.
people of one sort or another feeling uncomfortable in a place. And for that, I'm very sad. And I'm
Hmm.
hoping that as we design bathrooms in particular, and
Yes.
that we're going to have more options so more people can feel very at home to
Yeah.
be where they want to be.
I imagine, and especially because with each generation, they
Mhm.
identify more and more as
Yeah.
neurodivergent and disabled and queer, like a
Yeah.
third of millennials and then a half of Gen Z, and who knows with Gen Alpha. And so I think the direction we're moving is
Mhm.
gender neutral bathrooms, unisex clothes. Like we're
Yes.
away from the binaries completely in conversation, in language, and in design.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's going to be easier and there won't be
Hmm.
such tug of war because there
I
will be
hope.
room for everyone to be comfortable. Please and thank you. Like
I
that's
hope.
that's where we're aiming. So the aim, in my opinion, is never mind the labels, and we get the inclusive design, and we get people to find where they want to be and be able to give their gifts to the world. Like that's there's
Yeah.
flow in all of that. And there's cats on my desk. Just so you know, you did see you're watching. That was Elliot's tail. Okay, just to bring them into the conversation here. We have Theo here passed out on this side. And in cat stereo land, we have Ellie over here. So we have them both. They love to come when I'm in conversation. They
Of
love to show
course. They
up. It's
feel
really,
the energy,
yeah,
right? The
yeah.
energy of your enthusiasm, right? I love
Oh,
it. I love it.
yeah.
And neuroqueering, by the way,
Yes, yes, please. Yes, yeah,
is not just a neurodivergent and queer person. It's not just about neurodiversity and queerness. Neuroqueering is about looking at the world through the lens of neurodiversity and queerness, but also neuronormativity and all the norms, cis normativity,
mhm,
heteronormativity, and queering them. And so anybody can be neuroqueer. There are a lot of people who do identify as neuroqueer because they identify as neurodivergent and queer, but there's also this sense of like, wait a minute, everything I learned isn't true. Let's queer everything. Let's queer education. Let's
yeah.
queer relationships. Let's queer business. Let's queer these things in terms of questioning
Well,
and
it comes from
subverting.
query, like to query something,
Exactly.
right? And so
Exactly.
I have to say, so I looked at Nick Walker's writing
Oh,
and I was
yeah.
like, oh, I
Yeah.
get it now. Because yes, absolutely. I thought, well, there's intersectionality. We've got neurodistinct, neurodivergent, and queer. So
Mhm.
neuroqueer, ta-da. Oh no, that's not it. It's the
No.
sense of saying it's challenging normativity from a
Yes.
neurological perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. And queering it as in queering and questioning.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
really, all the ways our society and culture
Yeah.
functions, and so yeah, I think it's very expansive,
Yeah.
and I definitely get lit up by that, and the younger generations really resonate with the neuroqueering practice and
Yes.
identity of neuroqueer.
Yeah.
And so to talk to a Gen Zer who's like, oh yeah, I understand neuroqueer and I
Yeah.
identify as neuroqueer, and they've read about neuroqueering, and it's
Yeah.
just like a lifestyle almost, because you want to start to then decenter white voices and amplify more, queer voices, amplify BIPOC voices, amplify voices that are underrepresented in general. And that's exciting. That's exciting.
Yeah.
That's part of the neuroqueering practice.
Yeah. So Nick Walker was writing in some detail about this. Who else is out there besides yourself, obviously, talking about this? Like if somebody's listening in different generations and looking for who are the people I would follow on TikTok or who would I look for that's speaking out about this? I mean, Margaret, I think it's Maureen Dunn that's just written a book on
Yes.
neurodiversity at work, and also Ludmila Praslova, who I've had on the podcast. So there's some voices in that space in the younger generation, not yet writing the business books around it, who's talking about this that you would say would be a great follow?
I haven't found too many people talking about neuroqueering. I'm at neuroqueer coach, so I tend to be at the top of that search
Okay.
engine,
So
and Nick Walker look
look
as
for
well.
Pasha Marlowe
Yes,
and Neuroqueer
but
Coach. Yeah.
but I'm trying to remember the name. There's a podcast, and one of the co-hosts is Dr. Neff, Neff,
Oh,
and I'm
yes.
sorry I can't remember her first name. Divergent Minds might be the podcast. I and I know that she identifies as autistic, and
Yes.
they talk a lot on that podcast about the intersection of neurodivergence and queerness. And then,
Yeah.
of course, all these brilliant names are escaping me right now. But it's interesting because, like, this one person, like, who wrote the Canary Code,
Ludmila Praslova. Yeah.
Ludmilla, such a beautiful
Yes.
name,
Yeah.
is really specific to workspaces,
Yeah.
right? And then Maureen does a beautiful job talking about neurodivergence and disability, and kind of the community responsibility and justice around it. And so I feel like we're all really and Sunny Jane Wise, as I was mentioning, they talk a lot about the breaking down of neuronormativity, and
Yes.
there's so many creators that are spinning around my head. Like I really like Jamie Shields. He's mostly on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Disabled by Society is his business, and he does a beautiful job at teaching through graphics. He's a registered blind person who teaches through graphics about neurodiversity and mostly disability experience. Just there's so many cool people to
Yeah.
follow and talk to. And then I don't know their name, a Black autistic creator who at NGWAGWA. I can't
Okay.
remember their first name. I'm
Okay.
sorry. NGWAGWA. But that's the creator that's been through the Black Disabled Lens talking about neuroexpansive as a potential
Yeah.
word as an
Yeah.
alternative to neurodivergence. So there's just so many cool creators
Yeah.
and thought leaders and also nonlinear thinkers. I just joined the Octopus movement, which is like this whole movement of 5,000 nonlinear thinkers who
Yes.
love to queer everything, and it's so fascinating. So I encourage people in the audience to expand beyond the conversation about ADHD and autism, to expand beyond the conversation
Hmm.
about neurodiversity, to listen to voices that aren't white, to listen to voices that are talking about intersectionality and justice movements. It's really fascinating.
Thank you so much. I think we've gone through the questions that I had. I had notes and highlights and blocks on here. Um, how My final question, I think, is how enthused are you for what you're noticing right now, where we are in 2024 right now, having this conversation? How excited are you about what's coming?
I'm a little nervous about what's coming in the immediate future in 2024 in my country, United States. However, in the
Yes.
world of neurodiversity, I'm excited. The conversation that I'm most excited about and aligned with right now is creating cultures of neuroinclusion,
Hmm.
which isn't just in the workplace. It's
Hmm.
creating cultures of neuroinclusion also in homes and schools, and I would say even in the spaces between our ears and our minds. So, because I really feel like we need to get to the root of why there's so much stigma
Hmm.
and pathology conversation. And so,
Yeah.
talking to children and to parents and to
Mhm.
teachers. And I get really excited
Mhm.
about going to conferences and talking to the people who are up and coming leaders
Yeah.
in their generation of field. And so I'm very excited. I feel like it's endlessly expansive to talk about creating cultures of neuroinclusion, which also includes disability and
Mhm.
psychological safety and mental health and intersecting
Mhm.
all of those and
Mhm.
intersectionality. And so that wakes me up every morning. No kidding. I wake up excited to learn and unlearn and
Yeah.
write and read. I've never felt that way in all of my many, many careers as an ADHDer. We all have so many. And in none of my careers was I so excited to learn and unlearn to the extent that I find myself often forgetting to go outside or to rest or to eat or to play because I can get so consumed and absorbed
Oh, the rabbit
in my
holes.
work.
Yes. Yeah, no, I feel for you. I feel the motivation. I feel the excitement. I also feel like we're on the cusp of organizations recognizing they have to pay attention, not just because the business case is good, because it makes sense from a business bottom line perspective to have a diverse and respected workforce.
Mm-hmm.
um, Not because we're seeing more leaders in the organization self-disclose about their
Mm-hmm.
needs because they found out because their kid was diagnosed or whatever the
Mm-hmm.
path to this embracing of it, but also because there's a lot more lawsuits and
Mm-hmm.
actually naming it. We've got legislation that is now being enforced to an exponential degree. There's in the UK, it was 2016, there were three cases that went to tribunals, three judgments that were made that referenced neurodiversity. In 2023, the number rose to 278.
There's some awareness and action. Yeah.
Kaboom, right? So I
Yeah.
think there's a trifecta of motivation happening
Yeah.
here with the
Yeah.
business case, with the grassroots, like, oh my God, this just makes sense. And with a legislative push for the people that are finding it hard to see in other ways. So I think we'll have a groundswell of momentum based on those three things that I think is going to mean that you're going to be very busy coming up, and
I
hopefully me
hope
too.
so.
Yeah, that's the
Yes.
goal, right?
Yes.
Is to be,
Yes.
yeah.
I definitely am seeing a movement in HR and in universities and colleges, wanting specifically to talk about neuroinclusion, which again combines that neurodiversity and disability inclusion and psychological safety and mental health. It's really because you can't separate them,
Yeah,
right? If I go in and only talk about diversity of thought, it's not the whole picture.
yeah.
And so I think there's more awareness around it. I'm definitely seeing in the conferences I speak at and in the summits I present to, people very excited, and usually they're sold out sessions, and people, and today I had 66 new messages in the last hour on LinkedIn alone saying, I need to understand this more, and I need you to come to my organization to
Yes.
talk to us
Yeah.
about neuroinclusion. And so it's coming. It's coming. It's been,
Yeah.
a
I'm excited
long
for
road.
it because to this
Yeah.
point, I've been feeling like we've been in ERG land, and
Yeah,
ERGs, I love the work that ERGs are doing, but often I feel it's on the backs of the people who are already marginalized
exactly.
and with no budgets or low budgets.
Very true.
And it means that the speakers in this space are also expected to be no budget, low budget speakers. And
You got it.
I didn't work this hard for like, so there needs to be some sustainability here and some respect for the people that are in the conversation doing the work.
Absolutely.
So if you have an
Absolutely.
opportunity and you're listening as an organization, look at the conversation you're trying to have,
Yeah.
look at who you're trying to support, and please invest in it. Please
Yes.
invest in it, because everybody who's been in a marginalized group has been paying tax already, and it's been harder to get where they are. So please don't ask them to pay more tax. Please, if anything, think about how to reward them and keep their energy up, because it's probably cost them more to get right there.
So true. Costs them more to get there, costs longer and more time and energy to recover from the presentation, be it virtual or live. Yes, I'm so glad you said all that. It's so true. Agreed. Amen.
Yeah. All right. So let's keep, I'm thrilled to be working alongside you in this mission. And listeners, if you want to find, when you want to go look up Pasha Marlowe, Pasha, tell us where people should go right away to find out more about you.
LinkedIn is really where I live the most right now, and I'm at Pasha Marlowe on LinkedIn. Certainly, you can go to my website too, pashamarlowe.com. But I'm also on, for those that like Instagram and TikTok, at Neuroqueer Coach.
Neuroqueer coach. Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you, Pasha Marlowe, for joining me, for enlightening me to a greater depth of understanding about language and identity and an expansive perspective on the topic.
Thank you so much for having me, Claire. It's been so much fun. I hope to do it again soon.
Thanks so much for spending time here. Check out happyspacepod.com for links to all the episodes, including on YouTube, our online community, and helpful tools for work that fits. I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment on social media, or even better, drop a review. And please share with someone else who you know also deserves a happy space.